From Washington, D.C., this is Middle East Focus.
Welcome to Middle East Focus. I'm Alistair Taylor, MEI's editorial director, and today we're going to be talking about the regional challenge posed by Hezbollah. Since its founding nearly 4 decades ago, the Lebanese Shia political party and militant group has been closely allied with Iran and now forms a key part of Tehran's broader proxy network, which spans the region from Iraq to Syria and Lebanon to Yemen. There's a lot to discuss, but thankfully we've got 2 great guests on the program today to help us unpack things. Hanin Ghaddar and Kasra Arabi. Hanin is the Friedman Fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy's Gould Program on Arab Politics, where she focuses on Shia politics throughout the Levant. Kasra is a non-resident scholar with MEI's Iran program and an analyst in the Extremism Policy Unit at the Tony Blair Institute for Global Change. He specializes in Iran and Shia Islamist extremism. Hanin, Kasra, welcome to the program, and thank you both for joining us today.
Thank you very much. My pleasure.
Hanin, let's start with you. Hezbollah has been active in Lebanon for decades now, but in recent years it's become involved far more broadly across the Middle East, well beyond the country's borders. Can you give us a sense of its current scope of operations and footprint in the region?
Yes, absolutely. It has changed through the years, obviously. It was a little bit more, in the past 10 years, let's say, especially in Syria, it has increased, right? But it hasn't started, like this regional role hasn't actually started in Syria. They've been present in Iraq for a very, very long time. But it became more obvious and more structured in Syria, especially under IRGC commander Qasem Soleimani. He is the one who led Hezbollah's operations in the region at one point, and it became a lot much more direct military involvement in the region, from all the way from Lebanon to Syria, Iraq, Yemen, you name it. They've been involved in military operations, direct military operations, training, logistics, and soft power initiatives. Soft power initiatives meaning cultural, religious, economic projects to build roots in these countries, especially in Syria like they did in Lebanon. Today, as the war subsides in Syria, Hezbollah's role changed also in the sense that it's shifting more into soft power initiative rather than war, but they kept many military structures there. And of course, they're still present in the region in many ways militarily, but their presence is today more logistics and coordination, military coordinations and logistics, plus soft power initiatives in Syria. This might change again when they regain their access to hard currency. They will be able probably to kick off more soft power initiatives and military operations. Until then, they're just trying to maintain what they have.
Kasra, how does Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps view Hezbollah within the context of its broader regional strategy? And what's the nature of the relationship between the two?
Sure. Well, look, there's no doubt that Hezbollah is the IRGC's greatest regional asset. You know, Hezbollah was manufactured by the IRGC. IRGC commanders wrote and edited its 1985 manifesto, and the group has fully embraced Iran's supreme leader as the ultimate authority of the Islamic and Shia Ummah, or the Islamic and Shia world. So, put simply, Hezbollah is the IRGC's proxy. And in fact, it's what I call the gold standard of Iran's militia network. So, even if we look at the category of Iranian proxy groups, so even within that category of Iranian proxy groups, there's a spectrum that Tehran uses to identify the degree of ideological compliance. On the one hand, there's Eltizam Nazari, which means theoretical compliance. And that really means, a group accepting the theory of Velayat Faqih, which says Iran's supreme leader is God's representative on earth and as the ultimate authority of the Islamic world. And on the other side, there's Eltizam Amali, which means practical compliance. And that really means, not only accepting this theory that Khamenei is God's representative on earth, but actually practically implementing the day-to-day will of Iran's supreme leader. Now, certainly from Tehran's eyes, Hezbollah sits very much in the latter category. And that's why, really, it receives the most support from the IRGC, both in terms of military, financial and armament and logistical support.
Hanin, turning to the kind of domestic situation and Hezbollah's domestic role within Lebanon, Hezbollah has gone from being an important political player in the country to being by far the dominant one, with a hold, either directly or indirectly through its allies, on all of the key levers of power. The kind of long-standing description of the group has always been as a sort of state within a state, but that doesn't really seem to fit anymore. How would you characterize its position in Lebanon today, and what are its priorities?
Yeah, of course, this saying of state within a state, even that doesn't apply anymore, because Hezbollah built itself to be a state, a separate state within the Lebanese state with its own military, financial system, etc. Today, it seems that Lebanon has become a mini state within Hezbollah state, and Hezbollah state is a state within the Iranian regime empire. So this is how it looks like from Lebanon on the ground. This is how people feel. What they really want today is do not want turn Lebanon into an Islamic state. The ideological part and the religious part, they don't want Lebanon to be on that level. But what they need is for Lebanon to be under their control in terms of all decision making, whether military, security, financial, etc. That's what they need. They need the decision making. That's why when the Syrian army left Lebanon, withdrew from Lebanon in 2005, they decided that they need to take over. And we moved from a Syrian hegemony to an Iranian hegemony gradually. And today, everything in Lebanon today, from the borders that witness daily massive smuggling operations by Hezbollah, to the security apparatus, to state institutions, to the blockage of the government, everything is being decided by Hezbollah. And everybody realizes this today. So in a way, this is all the negative connotations. But if you look, the only positive thing from all this is that people finally realized who is responsible for the collapse today. And Hezbollah has moved from a resistance group and an opposition group to the actual authority, which has building its legacy over Lebanon's collapse.
I mean, building off of that, it seems that Hezbollah's dominant political role also comes with kind of huge risks as well. Lebanon is in the midst of a full-blown economic crisis, inching closer to collapse by the day. The problems that the country faces right now, the major economic and structural issues, are not really ones that Hezbollah is either interested in dealing with or particularly well-equipped to do so. Where does that leave Hezbollah, and what might it mean if we see, for example, a kind of a total collapse of the state?
Yes, absolutely. This is a very good question. And I think Hezbollah today is facing a dilemma. I don't think they know what they're doing. For the first time, I see them reacting than actually strategizing and acting. They're reacting to the events in the sense that their strategy today is to survive the economic crisis, not Lebanon's economic crisis, their own economic crisis that resulted from sanctions on Iran. So they have their own economic crisis. They are trying to deal with their own problems by using Lebanon's institutions and resources until further notice, that is hoping that a deal with Iran would bring back their access to hard currency and they will be much more comfortable. And in a way, they will be the only people in Lebanon, the only party in Lebanon, which will have access to hard currency. That being said, they are today looking at Lebanon as a failed state, and they're kind of trying to wrap their strategy around the reality that Lebanon is a failed state and how they can function within a failed state. This is their next strategy, because any kind of an alternative, which means reforms that would bring Lebanon's institutions back to life, is not going to work for them, because this means reforms is not only institutional and judicial, it's also will target their control in the state institutions, including border and smuggling operations and security issues. So they don't want that. They'd rather have Lebanon as a failed state, and then they will have access to hard currency eventually, and they will be the kings of a failed state rather than part of a functioning state. So that's where they're looking at it now. On the other hand, the problem is that because they became the authority and the authority responsible for this failed state and failed economy, and people lost everything in the process. The difference is that they are losing popularity within the Shia community. Their allies are losing popularity within their own community, speaking of the Free Patriotic Movement and the Aunists. So they have a problem to deal with in that sense. So in any case, in any upcoming elections, they will have to deal with this popularity issue, either by fixing it or by hijacking any upcoming elections or canceling them. So that's their main challenge.
Just to add to Hanin's point there, I think we're seeing this take place elsewhere in relations to Iran's militia groups, where, the Shia communities are turning against these groups. It's often thought in the conventional mainstream narrative that these are groups defending Shia interests, when actually, since October, and it's longer than this, but really since October 2019, we saw that protests on the streets in Iraq, in Lebanon, within Iran itself, the one common theme was this surging anti-Iranian regime sentiment. So that's being reflected elsewhere, and that's putting a lot of pressure, I think, on these groups.
Kasra, turning from the kind of question of Lebanon that Hanin was just talking about to the broader regional picture, as you touched on, Iran has used Hezbollah as a model that it's tried to replicate elsewhere in places like Iraq and other countries. Taking a kind of macro view, how successful have those efforts been?
Sure. I mean, as you rightly say, Tehran has sought to Hezbollahize the entire Middle East. If we zoom out, we can say that this model has obviously been successful in Lebanon, certainly in Iraq. It's very much in the making in Syria on a permanent basis. And, in Yemen, it's to a much lesser extent, but there is potential. So, for example, on the case of Yemen, although we have IRGC and Hezbollah operatives on the ground there, at the present, the Houthis are much more of a strategic partner than a proxy. They've not embraced Ayatollah Khamenei as the supreme leader of the Islamic world. They've not subscribed to the theory of Velayat Fari. But, part of the IRGC's strategy in manufacturing militias is creating loyalist cells within pre-existing groups and then splintering them to creating and manufacturing a loyalist militia. In fact, this is basically how Hezbollah was made, as well as other groups like Ahzab al-Haq in Iraq, which came out of the Mehdi army. Now, when I said that there was potential, this is because there are around hundreds of Yemeni students from the Houthi tribe studying in universities in the Islamic Republic. And so far as explicit loyalty, they have shown explicit or displayed explicit loyalty to Khamenei. So in theory, should the IRGC feel the need to ever, splinter a group out of the Houthis, in theory, it has the capacity to do so. And that would really further Hezbollahize the region. So in short, Lebanon certainly, Iraq certainly, Syria's in the making, and there is certainly potential for Yemen.
Kasra, following up on the question of Syria specifically, the IRGC has called on Hezbollah to play an increasingly active expeditionary role in recent years as well, not just as trainers, but as boots on the ground. Syria is, of course, the most prominent example of this. How central has Hezbollah been to Iran's efforts to shore up the Assad regime, and what future does Tehran envision for it in Syria?
I mean, it's certainly been key. Time after time, whenever and wherever the IRGC has instructed Hezbollah to intervene, whether that's, terrorist operations abroad, assassinations, or, military conflicts, as in Syria, Hezbollah's done so without question. And I think that really gives you a flavor as to the command and control structures that are in place here. That said, in Syria, Tehran tried to, at least optically, make out that the Syria portfolio was in the hands of Hassan Nasrallah rather than anyone else. So, for example, in 2012, when the late Hossein Hamedani became the IRGC Quds Force commander of Syria, or became in charge of that Syria dossier, when Hamedani drew up a plan to create the Syrian Besiege, what later became the National Defense Force, Soleimani and Khamenei instructed him to gain sign-off for his plan from Nasrallah. But, this is all optics, really. In fact, even on this example, Nasrallah reportedly rejects Hamadani's plan, but Hamadani does it anyway. So, that gives us a flavour as to what's really going on in Syria, the command and control structures, and the future. I think the future plan for Syria is, as I said earlier, is to Hezbollahize Syria, to create a permanent presence on the northern border of Israel, what Khamenei still regards as the Zionist entity that is a cancerous tumour that must be eradicated. That's still official Iranian regime policy. And I think moving forward, as Hanin was mentioned earlier, the IRGC wants to play a key role in the post-war reconstruction in Syria as a way to increase its soft power activities there. And that really is as a means to recruit and radicalize the local populations, so as to create, as I said, a firm, permanent presence alongside that border, northern border of Israel.
Kind of following up, Kasra, on the issue of Israel, I think one of the interesting things that we've seen lately is that Israel's engaged in repeated strikes on Iranian assets in Syria, part of its kind of broader shadow war with Iran. But Hezbollah hasn't really been involved in pushing back or responding to that. And I'm curious to get your thoughts on why that is and kind of what your sense of Tehran's broader military calculations are here.
Sure, I think part of it is related to domestic realities on the ground. As Hanin said, Hezbollah has its own localized problems. Tehran is fully aware of those problems. And part of this has been actually the result of the effect of sanctions on Iran's regime, which has had a big impact on Hezbollah. For example, even on wages, we're hearing that the IRGC in Iran has been forced to pay Hezbollah militants in local currency as opposed to dollars. So there are the domestic realities, the localized realities that have, I think, played a role in constraining any intervention or response. But also, I think the Islamic Republic sees Syria as a long-term project. And the hard power assets there are only, one aspect of that project. At the moment, they're expanding that soft power infrastructure in Syria as a way to recruit and radicalize young Shia men, young Arab men. So, like I said, the hard power assets are only one part of this. That said, we have started to see that, at least out in sea, there has been a tit-for-tat response. But still, as I was saying, the Islamic Republic is very careful because it's very aware of those localized problems. And also, it simply knows that it doesn't have the capacity, certainly financially and certainly militarily, to enter a conflict with Israel.
I mean, shifting gears over to the policy side of things and what the U.S. can do. U.S. has imposed any number of sanctions on Iran, on the IRGC, on Hezbollah over the years, including most recently a fresh round on May 11th, targeting 7 people connected to Hezbollah and its banking operations. How effective have these proven to date?
Yeah, this is definitely a much more complicated issue when you talk about sanctions. It's not sanctions are great or sanctions are bad. There's smart sanctions. There are smart sanctions that are ineffective. In that case, these sanctions actually contributed in containing Hezbollah's financial activities and restraining them. But sanctions, we have to remember that sanctions are not a policy. Sanctions are tools. And when they are used alone without an actual policy that would integrate sanctions, that's all they can do. Constrain a little bit, contain a little bit, but it will not really lead to a change of behavior of Iran and Hezbollah, the region, or even the Iranian regime itself against its people. So we need to remember that while there was an absence of real policy when it comes to containing Iran in the region and Hezbollah's activities in the region, sanctions had a limited effect on these guys. That being said, we realized that in a way, what they contributed to, in addition to constraining Hezbollah's financial activities, they really changed the perception of Lebanon's Shia towards Hezbollah in a way that it's not just sanctions. The circumstances in Lebanon in 2019 were perfect context for this, in the sense that when this economy started to collapse, the Shia community weren't very concerned because they thought Hezbollah, at the end of the day, Hezbollah provided itself to the Shia community a long time ago as the protector, that is the resistance, but also as the provider. They were the father figure of the Shia community. So they came to the Shia and told them, forget about the state, forget about the government. You are not Lebanese, you are Shia. I am your father. I will protect you. I am the resistance, but I also will provide for you because I have all these parallel institutions that would offer services and jobs and money, etc., etc. So the Shia community, when the news of a collapse in Lebanon, economic collapse started to come out, they thought that Hezbollah would step in and protect them. That did not happen because of U.S. sanctions against Iran and Hezbollah, but mainly because of the U.S. sanctions against Iran. Hezbollah has a cash economy. Sanctions will not affect them particularly. But the sanctions against Iran constrains Iran's flow of hard currency to Hezbollah. And that really exposed Hezbollah to the Shia community that they will have issues protecting and providing. So eventually we will have to look at other alternatives, and maybe the state should be our alternative in that case. And that's why the Shia in 2019 joined the revolution and became part of the Lebanese society for the first time in a very, very long time. Another thing that really changed the sanctions affected Hezbollah is the sanctions against Hezbollah's allies. That is Ali Hassan Khalil, Gibran Bassil, etc. These guys do not have a cash economy the way Hezbollah has. So sanctions really do affect them. So in that case, also, if you look at the Christian street today, the sanctions against Bassil and exposing Gibran Bassil, who is like the main Hezbollah's ally, exposing his corruption, sanctioning him for corruption issues in Magnitsky. Magnitsky was very effective in that sense. Weakened Bassil, meaning it weakened Hezbollah's main ally. That is, if you can invest in that result in the future, that means Hezbollah might have to suffer a loss in the majority in parliament eventually if their main ally loses. So that's a good result. But again, all of these are great results, but they are not policy. A policy should look at all that and invest in all these consequences in a policy that would actually be long-lasting.
Hanin, let's drill down on that a little bit more, kind of to your point that sanctions aren't policy. What other sort of broader policy moves would you like to see the U.S. make to address the challenges presented by Hezbollah?
Yeah, there are a number of things that the U.S. can do when it comes to Hezbollah. Obviously, there should be a policy, first and foremost. It's not just tools. There are many tools, but they should be part of a policy that has a specific goal. So today's the question is, what is the goal when it comes to Hezbollah? Getting rid of Hezbollah completely is unrealistic, right? So we need to contain Hezbollah. So first thing, we need to contain his weaponry, his arsenal, his regional role, but also we need to contain Hezbollah's majority and decision-making in Lebanon. So, and one thing I would say is looking at elections, the upcoming parliamentary elections in May 2021 as one of the main opportunities to actually contain Hezbollah's presence in the state institutions through shifting the majority in the parliament. This is one thing. Two, make sure that state institutions do not go after, what they're doing today since the assassination of Luqman Slim earlier in February. And this was not the first, and it's not going to be the last assassination or going after activists or people who are threatening Hezbollah's presence in Lebanon, in the sense that they are proving themselves to be alternatives, good alternatives to the Lebanese people. They are trying to silence or kill and threaten all these people. So there should be a policy also to protect outspoken Shiites or Lebanese who might be a good alternative. They're doing what the Syrian regime has done in Syria by silencing and killing and imprisoning all the good alternatives. So this is something that the U.S. should be careful about.
Kasra, I'd like to get your thoughts on the policy front as well. What are your recommendations on the broader issue of dealing with Iran's regional proxies? How should Washington and other key Western actors deal with the threat they pose?
So the first thing to note is, as I was saying, that the formal groups that make up Iran's militia network and their hard power assets are only the tip of the iceberg. What the IRGC has done over the years it's really built a soft power infrastructure across the Middle East and beyond, by the way. This isn't just a problem restricted to the region, but it's built a soft power infrastructure with the support of the Islamic Republic's soft power institutions and agencies, from the Al-Mustafa University to the Imam Khomeini Relief Foundation, and even the Iranian Red Crescent Society. All of these organizations and agencies have played a key role in, first of all, providing services wherever target nations, but using that as a way to recruit and radicalize the youth populations in these countries. So if we zoom out a bit, Iran's regional militias, the problem has really been viewed up to now as a foreign policy issue with the Iranian state. What I think that we really need to do is move away from this issue and really view it through the lens of counterinsurgency, countering violent extremism, and adopting a counterterrorism CT approach. Part of that means using those same methods applied to take preventative steps in these nations to prevent radicalization, because ultimately it's this ideology that is the life source to this militia problem. So part of that, I think, is this. So moving away from viewing it as being strictly a foreign policy issue with the Iranian state. This is an issue that affects Shia communities and communities beyond Iran. But also, I think it's quite clear right now that Washington does have leverage over the Islamic Republic. So part of that should be to use that leverage as a way, I think, to expand any agreement with Iran to include part of the regional picture, and doing that before giving Iran sanctions relief. I think that actually the Europeans, by the way, would be much more inclined to supporting this approach today than they were, say, last year. So I think those are the ways I think that this issue can be at least slowly addressed, or at least, as Hanin was saying, developing a policy rather than using sanctions as an end rather than a means to achieve anything.
We're running short of time, but before we wrap up, Kasra, I'd love to follow up with you on that latter point. Do you think with the efforts to revive the 2015 nuclear deal and the talks in Vienna that we will see room to kind of include the role of Iran's regional proxies in those talks? And do you think anything's likely to come out of that on that front?
Sure. I mean, I think if there is a return to the JCPOA, the nuclear agreement, without addressing these outstanding issues, and if sanctions relief is given to Tehran in response, I think that it would actually have a negative impact in terms of what we're seeing in the region today. That's because, look, in 2000, starting from the Joint Plan of Action, the interim agreement, when we saw sanctions being eased from 2014 onwards, and then with the nuclear deal, and then post 2016, what we saw is a surge in the number of IRGC gold standard militias. So the IRGC trying to replicate its Hezbollah model, particularly in Syria, again in Iraq as well. And at that time, US officials, said quite openly that they couldn't guarantee that some of this sanctions relief wouldn't go into the hands of the IRGC and its proxies. We saw that take place. If that possibility existed back then, today, that the chances of that happening has increased significantly. Why? Because of the changing domestic landscape within the Islamic Republic. The IRGC is currently expanding its power at an unprecedented rate. And it's transitioning from what we call the deep state to the state in its entirety. It's taking over state institutions. Now, this isn't a military coup against the clerical regime. Rather, it's being fully endorsed and supported by Ayatollah Khamenei. So the point being that if sanctions are eased, the chances of that actually enriching the IRGC this time round, and that having an impact and going into the pockets of Hezbollah and other militia groups, is much higher. And that's why I think that if there's a time to bring in the regional issues, bring in the regional militias, it's really now where Washington has that leverage. Once the sanctions are taken away and Iran receives sanctions relief, Washington's hand won't be as strong as it is today.
Hanin, you've got the last word here. How do you see things developing going forward?
Well, it depends on different scenarios, and I think Kasra has already discussed some of those. For Hezbollah per se, they're trying to buy time today, right? That depending on how the negotiations between the U.S. and Iran go. So their ideal situation is that to go back to the deal, get sanctions relief, and so Iran can start giving them back the dollars that they desperately need. When they do that, when they get that much money, and they will get much more money than anyone else, including the Iranian people, they will revive some of their regional activities, local activities. They will revive some of their soft power initiatives and social services in Lebanon and Syria in order to regain the popular support that they have. And they will be definitely have more readiness for war. Like today, with the conflict in the region between the Palestinians and the Israelis is evolving, Hezbollah today is under a lot of pressure to respond to this or do something about it. But they won't, because their military capabilities are very, very weak and limited today. They cannot fund a war. They cannot fund reconstruction. And if they lose their weapons, they cannot rebuild them. It's going to be very difficult for Iran to restock their weaponry. So they're using the threats of their missiles rather than their missiles. But when they are ready, when they have more money, they will definitely be able to revive some of their programs, but mainly they will be able to get more weapons. They can be able to use their weapons. They will be able to restructure their military forces, which today are suffering. So this is what they're hoping for. And they will be ready for everything else, to control more of Lebanon, to control the people, regain the resistance rhetoric, which has died recently. They want to revive it, of course. That's their ideal situation. So they're waiting and hoping that this happens ASAP. Meanwhile, they are not going to do anything to jeopardize the chances of this. Meanwhile, they're just trying to use whatever is left of Lebanon's resources, the central bank, the people's money in the banks. They're going to take everything they can to continue the smuggling operations, the drug production, drug trafficking, you name it, in order to get to a point where they actually survive this. However, if this doesn't work, and if something in the deal, if the deal doesn't go as they'd hoped to for it to go, then they will have to compromise. And that is an ideal situation for us, for the people in the region, for the Lebanese. And if they compromise, they will have to accept some kind of a transitional government, and one that would implement some reforms and get the country back on its feet. This is the worst scenario, really the worst scenario. The other thing that they are trying to achieve is make sure that they don't lose the elections in 2022. So this is also another two scenarios situation where if they lose the majority, they will be very constrained and very under a lot of pressure. The other scenario is that they win, they will continue using the state institutions' resources, and they will continue taking the decisions on behalf of the Lebanese people. So if you see there are more than one scenario, more than two scenarios here, depending on what happens in Iran with the U.S. negotiations, and also depending on what happens in the elections of 2022 internally. So there are internal factors and external factors that will contribute to Hezbollah's future plans and strategies. Meanwhile, they're just reacting. They have no plan, no strategy, and this is exposing them very much to the Lebanese people.
We'll have to leave things there for now, but Hanin, Kasra, thank you both for joining us on the program today.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks so much, Alistair.
And thank you as well to our audience for listening in, and to our production team for their work on today's program. We will see all of you next week.
This has been a presentation of the Middle East Institute. To support MEI's programs and podcasts, please donate at www.mei.edu. Thank you for your support.